So I have to begin with a confession this morning. It may not come as a surprise that I'm a history nerd. But more than that, I am a history nerd who spent many years looking through a lens that is that anthropological lens. And that lens taught me one thing above all else: that we are always in danger of centering ourselves. When we pick up a book, regardless of its topic or its genre, and most especially if it's an ancient text, like a scroll or a fragment or a gospel, we most instinctively read it through the eyes of who we are right now, in this century and in this culture, with all of our assumptions kind of packed into our own back pocket. We take the words of people who lived 2,000 years ago in a world we can barely imagine, and we translate them not just linguistically but culturally. We dress them in these ideas that Hollywood has clothed. We give them our values, and we call that result tradition. But what we end up with is a half-truth. Not a lie exactly, but a truth so filtered through our own reflection that the original voice, the actual human being who lived and breathed and believed, gets lost underneath our own interpretation of them. As a young scholar, and I mean child, I learned a different question. Not what is the story being presented to me, but what is the story that is missing? And how does that missing story change everything? Now, as you might imagine, I was not the most popular child for a volunteer teacher in a Sunday school. Those questions were uncomfortable for adults of my Christian church. They didn't have the scholarship to answer them. They only had dogma and creed that they believed they had to live into. And I was told that my questions were special, and I was taught to keep them for God alone. I mostly did. Until college, anyway, when on a pre-seminary track, I was introduced to the Nag Hammadi scriptures and Elaine Pagels. Her extraordinary work with those papyrus texts made my mind go wild, because I realized at that moment exactly how curated the Christian scriptures were and how many stories were missing. And that's the first time I met Mary Magdalene. It was then when I realized we were not just misreading Mary Magdalene, we had lost her completely. And the losing was not entirely by accident. If I was going to find Mary, I had to begin by setting aside what I thought I knew and ask, who was this woman in her actual world, in her actual time? We begin with, she's a woman from Magdala, a prosperous fishing town of the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, a cosmopolitan center of trade. She wasn't a woman from nowhere. She came from a place of means. Now, in the Christian scriptures, the Gospel of Luke tells us that she was among the group of women who traveled with Jesus and provided for the ministry out of their own resources. That was never lifted up for me. Hear that. The women provided for the ministry out of their own resources. These weren't passive followers. They were women of means. and agency that made this movement financially possible. And Mary was listed first among them. Now, in every list of female disciples in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, right, her name appears before all others. This is a structural thing. It is equal to Simon Peter's position in the apostles. Now, Mary, she is at the cross when male disciples have fled. She's at the burial of Jesus. She's the first to the empty tomb. And she is, in the words of the early Christian figures, church figures who understood what it meant, what apostolorum, the apostle to the apostles, the one who was sent to the ones who were sent. She's not a penitent sinner. She was a leader, a witness, the person that the risen Christ trusted first, and most importantly, gave the news of the new history for Christianity. So how did we lose her? In 591 CE, a pope preached a sermon in which he looked at three separate women in the gospel: Mary Magdalene, an unnamed sinful woman in Luke, and Mary of Bethany. And he declared them all one person: a woman, a sinner, and a prostitute, where there's nothing in the text to support that they are one person. But a pope said she was, so the institution agreed. And for 1,400 years, that's who Mary has been. Here's the question I can't let go of. Why? What did the institution gain by making her that? Right? It gained control of her story. A forgiven sinner is a safe container. She, this combined Mary, owes everything to those who rehabilitated her. She is grateful and penitent, and she does not lead or cause trouble. She does not teach. She does not speak with an authority, and the institution doesn't authorize anything she does. So then in 1945, an Egyptian farmer digging near Nag Hammadi unearths a sealed clay jar, and inside were 52 early Christian texts, including the Gospel of Mary. These were buried in the desert about the same year that the bishop wrote that letter that defined what would or would not count as Christian scriptures. Someone thought it was special. They didn't agree with the bishop. They couldn't burn those texts, so they buried them. They sealed them and gave them to the earth for safekeeping. And for 1,600 years, the earth did that. The Gospel of Mary, when finally surfaced, showed a Mary who steadied frightened disciples, who carried private teachings of Jesus that the male apostles never possessed, and who was challenged by Peter and defended by Levi with words that have echoed ever since. If the Savior made her worthy, who are you to reject her? That question, buried in a jar. The people who asked it lost. They buried it rather than burn it, and they think we need to ask ourselves, why? Why did they believe in it? I think they believed, even under pressure, that the truth has a way of surviving. that the real doesn't require the institution's permission to remain real. That someday somebody would dig it up. So why do I bring you such a historic and kind of Christian story this morning? Because I think Mary's story is remarkable. But realize it's also not only her story. No matter what religious tradition you claim, together in UUism, we are a people who believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person, every voice. Not every person that fits in the institutional narrative, but every person. Not every person whose story is convenient or comfortable or easy to tell, but every person, which means every story, every voice, every truth that's too costly to speak in its own time and that got sealed away and buried in the desert of someone's silence. So my question for you this morning that I want you to sit with rather than answer quickly: what have you buried? What part of yourself? What truth about who you are or what you have survived, what you have known, what you have longed for, got sealed away because the institution around you, the family around you, the culture around you could not hold it because it was too threatening, too inconvenient, simply too much. Maybe that's your identity. The self you understood yourself to be before someone told you that yourself was not acceptable. So you put it in a jar and you covered it over and told yourself, someday, maybe someday. Maybe there's a family story, something your grandmother knew or your mother knew, and neither of them really spoke aloud. A grief, a shame, a truth that got handed down in silence because words for it were just too hard. Maybe it's your own voice. The one you were told was too much or too loud or too certain, too female, too young, too old, too outside the lines of what counted as worthy. If the Savior made her worthy, who are you to reject her? Here's what I know about buried things. They do not disappear. They wait. Mary's story did not disappear when Pope Gregory preached his sermon. It waited in clay and sand in the fragmented memory of communities who kept asking inconvenient questions. It waited for centuries. And there's a cost in that waiting. When we bury the truest part of ourselves, the cost is not only ours to pay, it compounds over time. It's passed down. Your children, your family, your community will inherit the shape of your silence. Not because you were weak, because you were silent, you were surviving. And sometimes, like those farmers near Nagamati, our children's children will dig up what we buried and hold it up to the light and say, "Why did no one ever tell us this was here?" So what can we gain by unsealing our hidden stories? The jar that's unsealed. What relief might we know? What burden are we carrying alone that can be carried in community? Because carrying a burden alone is exhausting. to unseal it, to speak it, even imperfectly, even if it's just allowed to yourself, is stopping the secrecy. Our community, like this one, it exists in part to carry what doesn't need to be solitary. You might actually gain your children's inheritance, or your children's children, or the next generation you see growing here. The story that they get with your willingness to speak aloud gives them a little bit more understanding. That fragment can change what they know as what's possible for them. Or you might just gain yourself. That self that's been waiting. It's not angry for you. It's not angry at you for that burial. It understands that you were surviving, and it's been patiently waiting. Someone buried Mary's gospel in a clay jar and gave it to the earth, not because they had given up, but because they believed that the truth does not require an institution's permission to survive. I don't know what you've buried. I don't know what got sealed away in you before you arrived in this room today. I don't know which part of your story is still waiting in the desert for someone to strike it with a shovel and hold it up and say, "It was here all along." But I believe it's there. And I believe the search for that is holy, and the digging is actually worship. That the free and responsible and sometimes terrifying act of uncovering what is true about yourself and your life and your world is not a departure from your spiritual path. It is your spiritual path. So I will not tell you what you'll find when you unseal that jar. I will not promise that the text will be complete and that the story will be tidy or that it will be easy. What I will tell you is this: someone thought it was worth preserving and sealed it away carefully, gave it to the earth, trusted that one day someone would be ready to receive it. Oh, Mary, we found you. What a beautiful place to be. In finding her, may we find ourselves. May you find this to be true. May it be so.